All right, so this is Decoupled User Interfaces, and Bridging the Gap was a title that I kind of stumbled upon and hoped to elucidate on more, but we'll see if I get there. We were just discussing, this is probably the most actual case study session in the schedule today, because this is actually something that we've built and I'm going to try to show you. And also talk about some of the rationales behind it, and then throw in like a sprinkling of, hey, let's imagine, let's see what happens next. So, on with the show. I'm Jeremy Dickens. I am the CMS technical lead at the Weather Company. We are now owned by IBM, so I have to put the obligatory /IBM in everything I do. I am logical with a K almost everywhere, so if you see Logickal, that's likely me. So outside of this room, this is what nearly everyone says when I talk about decoupled user interfaces for the backend. Like, why do that? Especially in Drupal. Like, Drupal's known as being like, hey, you've got editorial interfaces right there. Why mess with a good thing? We're going to kind of come back into that and talk about that later. But this is something that I think it's been interesting to hear how many people in this room have been thinking about this as well. So when I say nearly everyone, I think most of the people that aren't asking this question are here right now. So to give you guys some background on weather.com, we were touted for a long time. We were the most highly trafficked Drupal site in the world. We did that by being progressively decoupled at a time when nobody else was doing that. And I'll give my first big props and name drop to the MediaCurrent guys, who were a huge partner in getting that built. So the basic idea of the architecture was all of the management and anything that could be cached, like the markup and articles and that sort of thing, that was all coming straight from Drupal. But anything that was going to be dynamic content, or things, like things like the weather data, or things like even embedded images and videos, were going to be handled by an Angular plugin layer. And then there's a bunch of glue that kind of helped all that work. So a bunch of panels, custom panels work, ESI doing some magic, making sure that we knew like where the user was in the world, gave them the right forecast, and then having this back-end external data store that other consumers could read from. So talking about Drupal as the management piece, we actually have a group of people whose job, it's not their only job, I don't want to sell them short, but a big part of their job was managing pages in Drupal, panels pages. It was mind-blowing to me when we started, because when I had used panels in the past, panels were something that like you configured and you exported into code and you like really didn't touch them again, and TWC treated them like content. Editors were going in constantly making changes to these things. I took a video of this basic process. A lot of you have seen panels before, but just to give you an idea of what these people would do every day. The reason I took a video is that this is my local, and I had to edit this severely because it was so non-performant. But as you see, there's this enormous list of panels panes. These are all Angular modules where our custom integrations are exposing bits of Angular code back into Drupal, then providing them with a UI to make some configuration about that front-end piece. And I think what I do here is probably go and make a change to a title. Then they will go and they will save it. And then eventually, I should have edited this more, shouldn't I? They'll update and save. And then you'll see it went from Weather Radar and Maps to Weather Radar and Map Room. So basic panels functionality. And they would do this all day long, every day. They would take items from one side of the page, move them into another side of the page. This is the thing that they did. So then there was a decision made to go from being a progressively decoupled property to one that was fully decoupled. And these are a lot of the same reasons that just about anybody who starts thinking about decoupling has some of these at some point. So I don't know that it makes a whole lot of sense to dive into these. Most of you in the room know about these pain points with Drupal and large monolithic systems in general. So let's just say there was a lot of a lot of push to fully decouple. Another thing about the developer velocity and the dev effort, I think it's important to note that our Drupal team is outnumbered by the Java developers by probably a factor of 5 to 1 plus, possibly even 10 to 1 at times. So you're literally talking a Drupal team of 3 people plus some contractors versus 30 to 40 to 50 people. So if we couldn't do it rapidly, they would get angry. And there was a lot of times we couldn't do it rapidly because we just didn't have enough people. But our front-end development team is like super sharp, and they went and figured out how they were going to do some decoupling. And they settled on this thing, NERF, which was a really clever acronym for Node, Express, React, and Falcor. I give them mad props for the acronym, even though they would, through their development process, turn that to Koa, Inferno, Node, and GraphQL, which is king, but maybe not so catchy as NERF. But it feeds into another pun that I may or may not have time to explain. It has no CDN dependencies whatsoever. There's no ESI involved, so they can actually be CDN agnostic. That was a very big deal to them. They were able to read all the content that they already, in a lot of cases, were reading from our sort of API, CMS API layer that wasn't Drupal. But what was interesting is when they built this, they actually inherited a bunch of concepts from the DNA system in Drupal. So they have page configurations, and they're variants of different pages. They have layouts, and they call them layouts, and they're basically regions, right? They still call their things modules. They could have called them anything else, but they're still called modules. And naturally, they're doing everything code-based, but it was really good because it meant, hey, we've got something that we can work on here if we're able to kind of make these integrate a little bit better. But that has some pain points, and I probably should have just not put any text on this slide at all because it pretty much says it all. From a product point of view, NERF was a complete black box. They used to have all this configurability and this power to make new pages and to change configuration on pages and highlight, they want a new ad somewhere, they have one person that just gets to go in and do it. Well, now all of that is a code deploy and requires a front-end dev to do some work and get that code shipped. So these product managers now really did feel like they were no longer actually independent actors. They were completely dependent on the front-end team. Which leads us to the page management system. So we as a CMS team, bless you. That is kind of what they said. Slightly more anger involved, I think, though. So what was interesting is that as TWC was going more decoupled, our team was more focused. Instead of being the engineers that were keeping the entire site up all the time, we were able to start focusing on technologies for content management specifically. Like, we're responsible now for this editorial layer. So I said, all right, we're gonna unpack this black box. What do we need to do? So obviously the baseline requirement, we've got to give some amount of page configuration functionality back to these people and give them some agency again. But whatever we do has to be compatible with the architecture that's been built. It's got to be able to write to an external data store because that's where they're reading all of their data from. And we were given a very specific directive that it had to have the absolute bare minimum amount of custom code. We had to be able to do this nearly out of the box. So, and this is where, this is the other big sort of name drop. For that, Matt Davis and I worked very hard to meet those requirements, and the Media Current team jumped in, but also there are a lot of other people in this room or around the conference, if they're not in the room already, that indirectly assisted with this whole project, because the API is built on Drupal 8, JSON and JSON API extras, Open API and schemata. We've got SAML user authentication. That's not technically something that a lot of people here maybe have worked on. And then we're using fly system to push files around. I think it's really interesting that this is just about as old as the idea for this conference as is like so many, and Contenta, because in Baltimore, we had not really made a commit in anger on this project yet, I don't think, had we? I mean, we were talking to Matteo about, hey, we really want to use JSON API, we might be able to help. But we also got another interesting MVP requirement, which was our system itself had to be decoupled. Okay, so we're able to do that by having a couple of good front-end developers who were able to jump in and work on this, using React for the front end, and then Redux to manage their state, Node and Express. So those things are all like pretty much your typical, hey, we're going to build a little JavaScript web app. But what's also interesting was we were given the opportunity to pull a UX designer in who could spend time with these product people, look at their existing process, and look at their workflow, listen to their pain points, and actually think about building something that was completely outside of the Drupal box. So here's the point where I'm going to show it to you. So I'll explain the other pun, is that our product manager decided to codename it Moonracer, who was the king of the island of misfit toys. So there's where the king reference comes in. So when you log in, you're basically presented with a list of pages. Pages have names, they have IDs, they have routes. All of this is coming directly from the Drupal backend on render time. I don't think they're actually doing any caching on this at all. But the basic idea would be that you might search for the home page. You go, all right, that's the home page I want. And then you're presented with this fairly simple interface. You have some information about the page, and you have some regions. And then there's this empty module space. What's that all about? Well, we'll click into a region and we see that we have a number of modules defined. We can click one of these modules, and we'll do something like that. And maybe we'll also take this one and we'll move it down here. And you notice that anytime that a change is made, it highlights the item in yellow so that you can see what's going on. Oh, well, what if we don't want to do that? What if we decide, well, hold on, we've got a reset button that will bring us back to our original state. But we do want to do something. So the funny story is, I'm going to hit publish here, and what that has done, we will go over to the actual page configuration. So this is a JSON API page configuration coming out of our Drupal instance, using JSON API extras to pick and choose which fields we want in the API. And you see that our API is reflecting that change we made. We're going to take another quick look at the Drupal side, and you see that this module instance configuration was updated about 35 seconds ago. So the thing where the wheels are going to come off this demo a little bit is that yesterday they broke some things for me. So this may or may not work. Let's refresh and see if we see our change. We do. We have just changed content on a decoupled page from a decoupled system. The reason why I had some hesitation there is that before this sort of demo instance of their front-end code was pointed directly at our API, which meant we could make a change and it would be there. And then on Friday they decided, oh, well, we need to get it pushed, we need to get it looking at S3. And they didn't configure the caching layers yet. So the idea behind it, though, is that as you see, this document, This is the ID of the page configuration document. We have two related document types, the module instances, and the layouts that we include as a query parameter onto the JSON API call. And then we package that up with Fly System and shoot it across to S3 for the front end to consume. So they're obsessed with performance, and they found that S3 was like faster than the TWC backend APIs any day of the week. So we said, okay, we'll do that for you. We just have to get the caching layers fixed. That'll be next week, I think. But yeah, here is an example of our JSON API, the raw JSON API endpoint. You see our different content types. The fields that you see, I'm used to swiping, sorry. The fields that you see here are one of these modules, which this is just a JSON schema document that's been dumped into Drupal in a completely just, here you go, Drupal. Our content types are actually like really not normalized at all. We're using raw JSON fields to just store whatever JSON those front-end developers decide however they want to do it. We let them handle the validation. They say, oh, this is what you want your module to look like. That's the configuration. You know best. Give it to us and we'll store it for you. And we'll make sure that it gets output in a way that is consistent with how you input it. That is effectively the MVP of Moonracer. The one other thing that I wish I was able to show you right now was this fancy preview button, because I heard a lot of people asking questions about how do you do preview? How are you going to do preview? And we were supposed to have that ready, except yesterday, ironically enough, they said, oh, no, we've got to redo it, and we have to authenticate the preview endpoint with JWT. So they said, all right, well, we'll implement that, and the front end team did. The front end team for Moonracer isn't back until Monday. So I'm not able to show you that, but I can explain it, how we're doing it. Is they actually have a special endpoint, a preview endpoint, that provided you have the proper authentication token, you're going to make a request, you're going to hit that button, it's going to make a request to that endpoint with this data in the page configuration. And that's enough for their code to say, oh, don't use the configuration that I'm accustomed to using, use the one that they're telling me about from the preview. And it's basically just another directory in our S3 bucket, and it just goes and looks there. So, but it's a different endpoint, so we avoid any danger of poisoning the caches. We don't have to set up a whole different infrastructure for actually previewing the content. It actually comes from weather.com. You just have to, know the secret handshake to be able to do it. So that is how we're tackling that problem with this particular project. How am I doing on time? Not too bad. All right, so again, why decouple user interfaces? I think a lot of people here, this is definitely like, preaching to the choir, but to me, the biggest deal is you have this opportunity to completely reimagine the user experience for whatever it is that you're doing. But that's something that we should probably unpack just a little bit. User interfaces can always be made more intuitive. Everyone's data, I'm a firm believer there's no one-size-fits-all content management system. The reason why Drupal maybe is because it's so configurable. But when you look at like just the fields, the field soup that you can make on a node edit page, you can obviously see, you've seen some node edit pages that you wish you could have made simpler, and I think that's one of the reasons why you might want to do this. And we've already seen some compelling reasons from Ed Faulkner's demo this morning. I feel also that if you remove Drupalisms from the node editorial pages, you actually can reduce training time, which makes the people who actually need to edit this content happier, fitter, more productive. You can actually embrace some data models that might not just flow naturally into Drupal. Like I said, that module configuration is a single JSON B field because we didn't want to have to be responsible for modeling and normalizing that data. So that actually said, oh, well, you know what? We don't have to worry about displaying it, but it's in a format that obviously the JavaScript world can easily display. So it also gives the opportunity to let the different developers in their different fields actually work in those spaces without having to get too deep into everyone else's Cheerios. In our Drupal and Angular, we had configuration forms, but it was a subset of field API. This way, it's JSON schema. They don't have to learn any field API, Drupal, doesn't matter. So we can actually let the front-end developers completely be front-end developers, not have to get integrated at all with Drupal for the most part, and we become more API developers. But I also think that this is just the first barest minimum step into what I think is probably a really exciting world. I mean, imagining a world where you could have either more simplified or even more crazy and dynamic node edit interfaces, potentially ones you could just drop in on top of your existing Drupal site. I don't know about you guys, but we have an enormously complicated categorization system. We have like 56 vocabularies filled with thousands and thousands of terms, and they're always asking for oh, wouldn't it be great if we could drag content here and push content here, and if it could animate when this change gets made? Well, you could really totally do that if you decouple it. This one I think is also really interesting in that you could conceivably have a front-end UI that was pulling content together from multiple back-end data sources and not just Drupal. I mean, it could be multiple Drupal instances. What if you had a Drupal instance that was just for all those complicated taxonomies, and then you had another Drupal instance that was handling, image assets, and then you've got a third-party video vendor, and you need to stitch that into a record somehow, someplace. So this actually gives you the opportunity to say, okay, we can store references really well in Drupal. Maybe that's all we need to store. So I feel like I've rushed through this, but I'm actually at 22 minutes, so that's not bad. The biggest caveat, I think, is this is the trade-off. Anytime, until this becomes so much simpler, like maybe with a card stack or something like that, you're really making the decision of, well, can I just live with the convenience of doing Drupal out of the box, or is a real customized experience something that makes sense for me or my organization, my company, my client? It really is not one size fits all yet at all. So that's, I think, important to note. But in the background, you're starting to realize, I think we as a Drupal community are starting to realize, it's all just data. If we can now put it all into JSON API format and get it out to any consumer, or we can use GraphQL and get it out to any consumer without being hung up on, field underscore my underscore crazy underscore field, that's actually a win, and we can start thinking about it that way, as long as you're doing it in a way that everybody's got consensus around. I thought it was really great hearing Ed this morning use lingua franca in regard to JSON API, given that we've used that around TWC, or I've used it around TWC, around JSON API for months now. And kind of getting into the gaps, and this is where making the decision to do something like this, or how to proceed in the Drupal community with more decoupled interfaces. Decoupling already has this sort of gap between the data that you're trying to represent and the representation of it. And it's often sold as being that that gap is something that you want. But there are other gaps, I think, just in the user experience related to that data from an editorial standpoint. Something like CardStack is impressive because it actually does outside in kind of inherently, and that's something that Drupal is really trying to push now. But when you go decoupled, unless you use a tool like that, you're not going to be doing it. So finding those key points where it makes sense and actually improves the user experience, recognizing that you do have a gap there to fill with a tool like this is probably like, key recognition number one. And then I think finally, it's just or yet another tool. That's all decoupling Drupal is in general. That's all any of these modules or implementations really are. It's just another approach. We in the Drupal community, I think, for a long time have had a very much the, everything is a Drupal-shaped nail, that our Drupal-shaped hammer really wants to really nail in there. But now that we're decoupling, we're starting to see that there's all this other world full of things that we could potentially do. But it's important, like kind of like the way that our front-end team changed their tool set halfway through their implementation. It makes it really important to always be evaluating what your tools are in your toolkit. And that's where decoupling in general and decoupling of UIs is, here's another tool, but always keep thinking about where the next replacement for that's going to come. And with that, I have hit 26 minutes.